Welcome everyone to the University of Mexico Department of Anthropology's Speaker Colloquia series. Thank you all for participating today. Before introducing the speaker for today, I want to just read UNM's Statement of Land Acknowledgement. Founded in 1889, the University of New Mexico sits on the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandí. The original peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache, since time immemorial have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous peoples and gratefully recognize our history. And I'd also like to personally add that these kinds of acknowledgements are only a first step. And so I just wanted to share with you all some links to some organizations located here in New Mexico where you can learn more and get involved. These are the Red Nation and the Pueblo Action Alliance. And so I'll paste those links into the chat for everyone. And lastly, want to thank the Alfonso Ortiz Center for Intercultural Studies and the Latin American and Iberian Institute for their support for the speaker series as well. So our speaker for today, Sarah Leiter, is a PhD candidate in the ethnology subfield of the UNM Anthropology Department. She's conducting ethnographic fieldwork among New Mexicans of Spanish descent, many of whom identify as crypto-Jews or as descendants of crypto-Jews. Sarah's research explores narrative, ritual, and identification practices through a focus on dual citizenship and religious syncretism in the context of New Mexico. And before I turn over to our speaker, let me just make a few procedural reminders. First, please mute your video and audio during the talk in order to preserve bandwidth. And second, feel free to type any questions you have during the talk into the chat, and we'll address these during the question and answer session afterwards, during which time you may also just unmute your video and audio to ask your question directly to the speaker if you prefer. And finally, today's talk is being recorded and will be posted on the Anthropology Department's YouTube page. And so now, without further ado, I give the floor to Sarah Leiter. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me share my screen so that you can all see my PowerPoint. All right. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming. I want to start by acknowledging the UNM New Mexico Folklore Scholars Endowment. First, I want to thank the creators of and contributors to the endowment for making this talk possible. Second, I want to point to the word folklore because that's what inspired what I'm going to talk about today. I'm not a folklorist. I'm a doctoral candidate in the Anthropology Department in the ethnology subfield. But as I've begun to do my dissertation research on identification practices among New Mexicans of Sephardic descent, I've started to notice folklore coming up quite a bit. While the analysis I'm going to share today is very preliminary, it's based on about 3 years of getting to know people in this demographic and beginning to do ethnographic interviews and participant observation among them. So my argument today will be based on the idea that telling stories, or more specifically folk tales, can help to create social identities when others insist that those identities are mistaken. So through a few examples, I'm going to talk about how folklore can help to produce socially identifiable groups of people. While this might be obvious to cultural anthropologists, among folklorists, the term has been used to dismiss certain claims to identity. As I will discuss in this talk, using the term folktale can signify that a narrative is historically false. According to some folklorists, a folktale is a story that is fabricated by people and then transmitted to others without corroboration of its historical veracity. In contrast to this approach to folktales, I'm going to argue that telling a folktale can be a valuable strategy for making an identity real because folktales are stories that are created by people and transmitted to others. Paying close ethnographic attention to what might be labeled folktales can reveal how a particular social identity materializes and is reproduced. But before I talk more about this argument, I want to tell you about the group of people that make up my ethnographic example. Our story begins on the Iberian Peninsula in what are now Portugal and Spain in the late 15th century. At this point in history, the region was comprised of several distinct kingdoms, mostly Catholic, one Muslim. Jewish residents, those we now call Sephardic Jews, lived throughout. By the end of the century, the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella united their respective kingdoms of Aragon and Castile. They embarked on an imperial mission to expand Spain and turn all of its subjects into Spaniards, which meant Catholic according to the ideology that shaped their pursuit. In 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella conquered Granada, the last of the Muslim-ruled areas on the peninsula, and ordered all Muslims and Jews in their newly formed kingdom to convert to Catholicism or leave. Many tried to find refuge in neighboring Portugal, but 5 years later, in 1497, the King of Portugal delivered a similar decree and expelled Jews and Muslims from his kingdom as well. While conversion to Catholicism did save many from the sentence of expulsion, choosing to stay in either kingdom or migrating to any of Spain's or Portugal's newly forming colonies throughout the world meant potential subjugation to the Inquisition, a bureaucratic system meant to root out, prosecute, and eliminate those who committed the crime of heresy. During the Inquisition, those found guilty of offenses such as Judaizing or appearing to engage in Jewish practices often were sentenced to death. Despite these threats, some of the families who had converted to Catholicism from Judaism chose to become what scholars would eventually term crypto-Jews. Publicly, these crypto-Jews were Catholic. They were baptized, they attended church, and they insisted that they were Catholic to anyone who asked. But privately, in the secrecy of their homes, they were Jewish. They spoke to their children in Judeo-Spanish, sometimes called Ladino. They maintained the Jewish rituals and taboos they learned from their parents. And on their deathbeds, they told their grandchildren not to forget who they were. For those who remained on the Iberian Peninsula following the expulsions, crypto-Judaism and crypto-Islam remained perilous. The peninsula was the epicenter of the Inquisition, and in the early 16th century, thousands were convicted of heresy and burned at the stake. So some crypto-Jews decided to move elsewhere within the growing Spanish Empire, to a place farther away from the Inquisition offices, namely what is now Mexico. Unfortunately, by 1571, the Spanish Inquisition had established a field office, if you will, in Mexico City. The crypto-Jews who had migrated to Mexico again found themselves in the range of vision of inquisitional officers. So, as several historians contend, at the end of the 16th century, when Juan de Oñate traveled north on a Spanish mission to colonize New Mexico, a land farther away from the areas that could be easily surveilled by inquisitional officers, several crypto-Jews went with him. Some have even argued that Oñate himself descended from Spanish Jews. Today, many of the descendants of these Spaniards have no connection to Judaism. However, a subpopulation of New Mexicans of Spanish descent still identify as crypto-Jews or as descendants of crypto-Jews. They hold an awareness of their Jewish ancestry and the secrecy surrounding it, identify as Jewish in some way, even if they practice Catholicism, engage or have grandparents who engaged in some ritual Jewish practices, especially surrounding death, burials, mourning, and food, and sometimes possess some material objects that are connected to Judaism. This finally brings us back to today's theme, folklore. Today's crypto-Jewish population of New Mexico has been studied by many scholars, including historians, anthropologists, geneticists, genealogists, and yes, folklorists. Since the 1990s, all of these scholars have been in conversation with one another, participating in conferences such as those hosted by the Society for Crypto-Judaic Studies. Among these scholars, one debate in particular has produced 3 decades of impassioned arguments and built several academic careers. This debate has not been about crypto-Jewish history or crypto-Jewish practices or the nature of their religious syncretism or the population's social positionality in the context of New Mexico or the Sephardic diaspora. Instead, the question that has been most intensely debated among scholars of this population has been the following. Is this population actually who they say they are? That's right, it's their very existence, sorry about that. It's their very existence or lack thereof that has spurred roughly 3 decades of scholarly debate. Specifically, scholars have been interested, first, in whether some New Mexicans truly descend from Jews who converted to Christianity during the Inquisition, And second, whether they have preserved any identifiably Jewish practices, material objects, or oral traditions that might attest to that history. One of the reasons for this debate has been the secrecy that lies at the very core of what it means to live as a crypto-Jew. For those whose Judaism is enmeshed in a grandparent's urgent warnings of confidentiality, speaking to researchers about that Judaism would conflict with their most basic beliefs about it. In practice, this has meant that many crypto-Jews have been willing to share who they are only with researchers whom they know, especially those who live in New Mexico. But as I heard one woman say earlier this month, most families won't talk to outside researchers. These researchers don't get very far because people either won't talk to them or deny that they're crypto-Jews. So in very generalized terms, the scholars who are based in New Mexico tend to argue that the state's crypto-Jews are who they say they are, whereas those who deny their identity claims conducted research during shorter-term stays. One particularly vocal scholar who sits firmly in the camp that argues against the existence of crypto-Jews in New Mexico is a folklorist. Her name is Judith Newlander. In the early 90s, Newlander came to New Mexico, analyzed some of the stories and material objects she found among the self-identifying crypto-Jews who consented to be interviewed, and determined decisively that they were at best misinformed, or at worst, making it all up. Their crypto-Jewish identities, she argued, emerged only as a consequence of the appointment of a particularly receptive state historian. Their religious practices were remnants not of Jewish tradition, but of Christian Protestant influence in the region. Their ritual objects and burial customs were taken from the Ashkenazi Jews who began to arrive in the state in the 20th century. And their oral histories were nothing more than vain attempts to be seen as racially white in a place where whiteness might improve one's social status. In 2006, Newlander recruited a team of biologists to her cause, co-authoring a paper in which they argued, through genetic testing results that relied on a distinct disregard of the history of the Inquisition, that New Mexico's Spanish population was almost certainly not Jewish, crypto-Jewish, or of Jewish descent. The same year, Newlander published another article with no apparent sense of irony in a journal called Patterns of Prejudice. In this article, she posited that ethnographies supporting a crypto-Jewish presence in New Mexico were unsound because the family histories on which they relied were nothing but folktales. And there's that term again. What does Newlander, a folklorist, mean by folktale? And how does it serve her argument against the existence of New Mexican crypto-Jews? First, let's look at what she says about folk logic, or the logic that governs folktales. The distinction between academic logic and folk logic is straightforward. Academic logic discerns categories by differential, critical thinking. It strives for timeless, global accuracy, no matter what may be discovered. Folk logic, however, has a different purpose than accuracy. Folk categories of human distinction are self-authenticating social devices, involving not merely the clarity, but also the self-esteem and perceived entitlements of the group doing the categorizing. For Newlander, it would appear that folk ways of thinking ultimately are self-serving. In contrast to academic logic, which involves critical thinking and accuracy, folk logic involves a sort of sloppiness, a lack of concern for truth. It is a logic based not on objective reason, but on selfishness, on self-entitlements, on perpetuating falsehoods for personal gain. So the categories that come out of this logic are not, in Newlander's words, timeless or globally accurate, but instead are social devices, ploys to situate oneself in a more favorable position vis-a-vis other people. One way in which folk logic and folk categories get instantiated is through the telling of folk tales. For folklorists, a folktale is a narrative genre in which the structure is reminiscent of legend, a story that takes place in historical time, but not be verified as having happened in history. According to Newlander, folktales have an additional dimension when it comes to Spanish Americans in New Mexico who claim to have Jewish ancestry. She says that when scholars write about crypto-Jewish practices in New Mexico, these usually are not practices that the scholars witnessed or even learned about from a direct witness. Instead, they're practices that were reported to their informants. These reports of reports are, in folklorist terminology, fof tales. Fof, which stands for friend of a friend, indicates that the narrated content consists of the reported experiences of someone who, in Newlander's words, is always anonymous or too far removed to secure or verify the claims being made. The significance of doubly reported speech thus lies in the potentiality of its credibility or the verifiability of its historical accuracy. For anthropologists who have studied narrative, this orientation toward reported speech might seem a little strange. In anthropology, reported speech is significant not because it can substantiate or unravel a given account, but because it can point to how people develop a sense of identity, establish social relations, and make sense of the world in which they live. For example, in John Haviland's writing about a 90-year-old man in Mexico, the voices of others become the man's autobiographical framework. In Suzanne Oakdale's ethnography of ritual practices in Brazil, quoted speech demonstrates that the speaker has absorbed others' perspectives. And in Peggy Miller et al.'s study of childhood narrative practices, the researchers found that adults recounted children's experiences in front of the children as a method of socialization. In these and other studies, using someone else's reported words is socially productive. It helps speakers locate themselves and others in the social world. With these studies in mind, I want to return to Newlander's usage of folk and folk tales. I want to suggest that using her definitions of the very analytical concepts that are meant to discredit the authenticity of New Mexico's crypto-Jews actually can accomplish the opposite. For Newlander, friend of a friend tales can deny the population's presence because she focuses on the unreliability of the persons credited with allegedly witnessing Jewish practices among crypto-Jews. Ironically, this relies on a reification of her own folk categories of identity, including crypto-Jewish identity, particularly with regard to Judaism. For her, Jewish identity, including crypto-Jewish identity, depends on external evaluations and evidence of objectively Jewish traditions. But what if, instead of fixating on what's reported, we focus on the person doing the reporting? If we focus on the narrators more than the narrated, then we can see how the reality of New Mexican crypto-Jews is created in part through the very thing that Newlander says negates their existence. To clarify what I mean by this, I want to look again at Newlander's definition of folk categories as self-authenticating social devices. I take social devices to mean things that produce relationships and statuses in the social world. And self-authenticating suggests a sense of proactiveness, self-awareness, and independence from others' evaluations. Folk categories, then, are productive components of the social world in that they allow individuals to claim and convey the forms of social identification they choose for themselves, even if these are not recognized by those with a greater degree of social or institutional power. When crypto-Jews in New Mexico tell folk tales, they're not doing so in order to substantiate potentially unfounded claims about their pasts, or to convince others that their Jewish heritage is real. Instead, their folk tales subvert the sorts of institutionally mediated social categories that draw a solid line between Jews and Spanish Catholic New Mexicans. They destabilize the external evaluations that have socially situated them without their input. And they use the friend of a friend element productively, not to imply fictitiousness, but to indicate social approval, to say, I'm not the only one who knows this to be true. To see how folk tales are used in this way, I want to turn to a few narratives that were told at various times by two New Mexican women who identify as crypto-Jews. The first woman, who lived from 1922 to 2003, was named 𝗭cie𝗵𝗵𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀. 𝗭cie was a teacher, a caretaker, an heir to the Atrisco Valley land grant, and a practicing Jew who was raised Catholic. While I never met 𝗭cie, she left behind a handwritten memoir written over roughly 2 decades between 1970 and 1992 that is comprised mostly of crypto-Jewish folk tales and her interpretations of them. The memoir is currently being prepared for publication. The second woman, whose narratives I'm going to discuss, is a cousin and close friend of the first. She calls the author of the memoir Mama 𝗭cie and describes herself as 𝗭cie's daughter. A psychologist by training, she also turned to Judaism after being raised in Catholicism. Her name, which she prefers to a pseudonym, is Dr. Maria Sanchez. I've spoken with Maria on a few occasions, both in person and over the phone. I'll start with a few of the friend of a friend tales 𝗭cie included in her manuscript, and then I'll move to some of the narratives I've heard in conversation with Maria. In the first few pages of her memoir, 𝗭𝗫𝗄 writes, "My maternal ancestors, Don Fernando de 𝗭𝗲𝗃 were among the earliest colonizers in New Mexico. They walked the hot desert sands in 1692, which was the year of the Reconquista following the 1680 Pueblo Revolt. Their carretas, carts, carried provisions and clothing. They walked their families in search of settlements. Along the way, they stopped to pray. Little birds chirped their joyful song around the colonizers. They called the sparrows 𝗭dzisi𝗺𝗃𝗍, Ladino word for little songbirds, and shir means song in Hebrew, so that's where the word comes from. These 𝗭ዀɪs𝗺s were the musical sounds of nature. What beautiful music to have had as my ancestors sang the Psalms, Shiraz." On the next page, 𝗭𝗫𝗄 jumps forward to her own upbringing and tells readers that little children were taught very meaningful prayers. We were compared with the little birds. We were called 𝗭ὶriscos, songbirds. We and the little birds were their choir. Here, we see that 𝗭𝗫𝗄's folktale is not meant to provide eyewitness evidence of how New Mexican colonizers were praying in 1692. Instead, what it's doing is linking herself, a metaphorical songbird, to the earliest colonizers in New Mexico as they wandered the desert following their exodus from Spain. It's not difficult to see the parallels here between 𝗿𝗵𝗄𝗃 and the biblical Israelites who wandered the desert following their exodus from Egypt. Through this story, 𝗭𝗫𝗄 is allegorically connecting herself both to the biblical Israelites and to the Sephardic Jews who were fleeing the Inquisition. That she is a child in the story rather than an adult serves to highlight the intergenerational transmission of Jewish identification practices, represented here by singing and praying. It's also important to note that in this story, both groups of ancestors, the colonizers and the allegorically referenced Israelites, are in a period of seeking and insecurity. This lends precedence and authenticity to 𝗭𝗫𝗄's own relationship to Judaism and the sort of seeking and insecurity that have surrounded her journey toward a more public form of Jewishness. At the same time, the songbirds were joyful. For 𝗭𝗫𝗄, while identifying as Jewish is rooted in historical persecution, it is also a joyful pursuit. By placing the 𝗭𝗫𝗄𝗃 of her childhood alongside the prayerful yearnings of her ancestors, 𝗭𝗫𝗄's story reveals a particular intertwining of generations that is at once enmeshed in the trauma of the past and oriented toward collective healing in the future. As a metaphorical songbird, 𝗭𝗫𝗄 was with her colonizer ancestors as they wandered through the desert of New Mexico, just as they were with her when she learned their songs, just as she would be with her own heirs long after she died in 2003. As she told a distraught Maria that year, "I'm not gone, I'll be in your blood." Her folktale then is productive rather than evidential. It lends substance to her particular form of Jewish identification, a Jewishness that is rooted in ancestry, in future generations, in prayer, in insecurity, in joy, and in New Mexico. The second of 𝗭𝗫𝗄 Carrasco's folktales that I want to discuss is set in a much more recent period in history. She writes, "The Carrascos, having been in exile, were always aware of the tin box, which was buried in Mogollon, New Mexico. We never located the buried treasure in Mogollon. However, a tin box was found in the property of Solomon Luna in Los Lunas, New Mexico. Faye Blake, New Mexico Historical Society, told me about the tin box. It was found while a road was being built. In this tin box, a Torah was found. The tin box and the Torah was given to the University of New Mexico in 1950s. The box was found on the property that Don Solomon Luna had given his adopted daughter, Paula Luna, who married Don Narciso Carrasco, my ancestor." This story is important to discuss because if we were to use it in search of evidence of a crypto-Jewish presence in New Mexico, we would question the author's reliability pretty quickly. As far as I know, there was no news coverage of a discovery of a Torah or Hebrew Bible under a road construction site. There's no record of a tin box or a Torah being given to UNM, and I have even heard another crypto-Jew in New Mexico use this story as the joking premise of a sort of fairy tale. Nonetheless, if we put aside its historical accuracy, this story is another example of how 𝗭𝗫𝗄 brought her New Mexican Jewish identity into reality through this sort of friend of a friend narrative genre. This story roots the author's family tree in New Mexico and Judaism. It centers around a Torah, a Hebrew Bible, that was literally planted in New Mexican soil, unearthed only to improve the state's infrastructure and to augment the state university's collection of educational materials. Later in the manuscript, 𝗏𝗏 highlights the significance of this object being a Torah. She writes, Torah was strength to our spirit, for it was Torah that kept us together. Torah was our symbol of life. And then a little later, Torah was our way of life. So for 𝗏𝗏, this story about a Torah that is embedded in New Mexican land and contributes to the enhancement of the state also can be read as a story about her own family, her spirit, and her way of life. Through this story, she weds her Jewishness to her New Mexican family history, suggesting that her religion has been securely held by her family for as long as they've lived in the state. She also establishes that this heritage has been hidden from public view until recently. And the story incorporates the friend of a friend element through reference to a member of the New Mexico Historical Society, which adds an authoritative voice to her descriptions. Combined with the motifs of New Mexico, concealment, and Torah, this voice both creates and allows 𝗏𝗏 to inhabit a crypto-Jewish identity. The last of 𝗏𝗏's folktales I want to mention is the following. My grandfather spoke about ancestors who were expelled from Spain and Portugal. They carried few belongings. They were not permitted to take money or jewelry. Their homes, their businesses, their gold and jewelry was claimed by the royal crown of both Spain and Portugal. No matter where they went, the Inquisition caught up with them. Again, note the friend of a friend element. She heard this from her grandfather. But before discussing the story any further, I want to turn to an anecdote I heard from Maria Sanchez, 𝗏𝗏's adopted daughter. Here are Maria's words.
In our families, we would also have we were always ready to, I guess, move or go or have, I don't know what the heck. But we always had a stash of jewelry and stuff like that, ready to go. I'm not sure why, but we were ready to go. And I still do that.
Just or like food also and clothes?
No,
or
not
just
that. Just jewelry, something expensive that if you need it, it's there and you can go.
Notice the parallels between Maria's practice of keeping a stash of jewelry in case she might need to flee and 𝗏𝗏's story about ancestral victims of the Inquisition who were forced to give up their jewelry. In both narratives, jewelry seems to be an index of exile. And it also becomes an index of the sort of inherited trauma that's part of being a crypto-Jew. Regardless of the historicity of the Spanish crown's confiscation of jewelry, telling these stories lends a particular significance to the family's practices surrounding their valuables. When Maria puts together her go bag of expensive jewelry, this practice helps to establish her as a descendant of those who were expelled from the Iberian Peninsula. This practice becomes linked to her crypto-Jewish identity because of the circulation of these narratives. The final folktale I'm going to discuss comes from Maria. It's a folktale with the friend of a friend element because she's telling me what 𝗏𝗏 Carrasco told her about the experiences of their shared ancestors. The narrative is about early Spanish colonizers as they ventured into what is now New Mexico. Here are Maria's words.
She told me about how when we were coming, our people were coming, how we'd watch what the animals would eat so that we wouldn't starve. We'd eat what they eat.
We'd watch, we wouldn't starve, we'd eat. Like in 𝗏𝗏's story about the little songbirds, here Maria is placing herself alongside the Spanish colonizers who wandered through the New Mexican desert. Maria herself becomes one of the desert wanderers, doing whatever she can to survive, both physically and spiritually. Through this story, she's creating metaphorical co-presence with these crypto-Jews of 400 years ago, stretching her own sense of identity far beyond her own lifetime. By doing this, she's establishing a reality in which she can justifiably take on the identification practices of her ancestors, even if these were absent for much of her own life. So her externally observable traditions become less important. She's a crypto-Jew because, long ago, she wandered through the New Mexican desert trying to survive. I want to conclude
She told me about how
with the final 2 pages of 𝗏𝗏 Carrasco's manuscript. Not a folktale, but a letter written by 𝗏𝗏 dated June 14, 1992, and addressed to Rabbi Selnick, a congregational rabbi in Albuquerque. It says, Rabbi Selnick, you have taken a sincere interest in the conversos and the secret Jew. Therefore, I am entrusting my research in you. Use it the way you wish. I really feel that it is time to share our tragic history. We will indeed encounter debate. Are we not Jews? Our records are in the autos de fe, but I feel that we can be true Jews when we return to Torah, as Ramon Salas did on his bar mitzvah, April 10th through 11th, 1992. And in 1992, Ramon Salas was a 28-year-old in Albuquerque who had recently decided to take on the Judaism of his ancestors. Sincerely yours, 𝗭ecie𝗵𝗵𝗀𝗺𝗀. This is followed by the final page of the manuscript, blank, except for a 2-line note at the top. Rabbi, these pages are for you to record those who return to Torah. In one of my conversations with Maria, I asked her whom she thought 𝗭ecie was writing for. Was it the general public, the normative Jewish communities she joined, the scholars who debated her identity? Maria's answer should have been obvious. 𝗭ecie had been writing for her people, the generations of crypto-Jews who would come of age after she had gone. 𝗭ecie was, after all, a teacher who wanted nothing more than for her students to sing like the 𝗭cie𝗵𝗍𝗆, the little songbirds who carried on the traditions of crypto-Judaism. She entrusted her manuscript to Rabbi Selnick, who was known to work with crypto-Jews and was, in fact, 𝗭cie's own rabbi when she gave him the text. While she would have graciously allowed people of any background to read it, ensuring that it went to Rabbi Selnick was 𝗭cie's way of passing its contents on to fellow crypto-Jews, people whom the rabbi would be mentoring when, in 𝗭cie's words, they chose to return to Torah. In her letter to the rabbi, 𝗭cie mentioned a debate, are we not Jews? Despite its implication that her text was to substantiate her claims to Jewish heritage and identity, her goal in writing it was not to participate in such a debate or to justify who she knew she was. Rather, her mention of the debate that has formed several scholars' research agendas should be taken as a reflection of her great proficiency as a teacher. She was anticipating her students' questions, predicting how they might react to her words. Her manuscript, her folktales, were her response. And in true teacher fashion, it concludes with an assignment for Rabbi Selnick. These pages are for you to record those who return to Torah. When you meet other crypto-Jews, help teach them what to do. Remember to show your work. Through these final pages of her manuscript, 𝗭cie tells us that crypto-Jews are not simply there to be discovered or disproven. New Mexican crypto-Judaism becomes a reality when individuals actively claim it, when they choose to connect themselves to their secretly Jewish ancestors. She did not ask Rabbi Selnick to record those who call themselves crypto-Jews or those whom a scholar might categorize as such. She asked him to record those who return to Torah, who act, who do something that would yield their crypto-Jewish identities. Perhaps, like 𝗭cie and like Maria, others in New Mexico would become crypto-Jews in part through the folktales and folktales they would tell. Thank you.